I'll start by saying hi, everybody. My name is Matt Taverna. I'd like to welcome you all to the Observatory on Social Media's Awesome Speakers event. As we usually do, I'm just going to do a quick introduction for the Observatory and the speaker series for those of us that might be joining for the first time. So the Observatory on Social Media, or OSoMe as the acronym is pronounced, is a joint project of the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at the Media School at Indiana University. OSoMe is an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media and technology, with a particular focus on social media, as the name implies. We conduct rigorous academic research, build analytical tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and work to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media professionals. So if you're curious about learning more about the observatory, please check out the link at the bottom of the slide there, awesome.iu.edu, where you can see our latest research papers, tools, or really anything else going on with the observatory. So as part of our interdisciplinary mission, we've organized the Awesome Speakers virtual event. This event consists of a series of talks from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. Please make sure that you check out the event page on our website. The URL is also there at the bottom of the slide, which has more information about past and future talks. As we're doing today, we'll record the talk, so you can see past talks if you've missed them, and find out the ones that we have planned for the future. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Jeremy Blackburn. Jeremy joined the Department of Computer Science at Binghamton University in the fall of 2019, and is broadly interested in data science with a focus on large-scale measurements and modeling. His largest line of work is in understanding what he refers to as jerks on the internet, and his research into understanding toxic behavior, hate speech, and fringe, and in extremist web communities has been covered in the press by the Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, BBC, and New Scientist, among others. So I'm excited to pass things off, but I'll just remind everybody of the typical structure. So Jeremy will give his presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll sort of open things up to the group to have about 15 minutes for discussion. So if you would like, you can leave questions in the chat, but we really encourage you to sort of hang on to them for later and then sort of ask them to Jeremy directly. So I will stop sharing and thank Jeremy for being here, please, everybody. And Jeremy, you can now, I believe you should be able to share your screen.
All right, let's see if this works. We're good?
Looking good.
Okay. All right, then I'll go ahead and start. Well, thanks, Matt and Phil and everybody for having me here today. So I'm Jeremy Blackburn. I'm an associate professor at the School of Computing at Binghamton University. And I'm going to talk to you today about alternative social media platforms, basically. So I'm going to start with something that is geographically near to my heart, if you will. In, I think, 2022, a guy that lives, I don't know, 10 minutes from my house went to a gun store about 10 minutes from campus here and bought an AR-15. And then several months later, he drove up to Buffalo and he shot 13 people in a grocery store, killed 10 of them, and then finally, plead guilty to domestic terrorism, hate crimes, all that kind of stuff. So again, this was local to me, where this kind of thing happened. And the New York State Attorney General, they made a report on this. Obviously, this is a big issue on the role of online platforms in particular in this mass shooting. And so it has a lot of good information in it. Obviously, it's it's dense. It's or not exactly the type of paper that we usually scientists are usually reading, but it's got some really good stuff in it for at least the purposes here. So, for example, let me bring up my laser pointer here so I can. There we go. All right. So, for example, this guy, the perpetrator of that, he learned a lot of equipment from just hunting, but also from instructional videos on YouTube and 4chan's K board, which is the weapon board. He used K to buy guns and body armor, finding, and then he also went to pawn shops and eBay and stuff like that. Additionally, he used K to get advice about his gear, to buy firearms and equipment, and also found other let's say, more shut off social media platforms like Discord channels, right? And this is where he learned details about ballistics and body armor. And this is ultimately what the Attorney General's office decided was one of the things that helped him survive. Gunfire, the initial set of the initial engagement with the security guard at that grocery store, at the Tops grocery store. So, right, this social media online platforms clearly are playing a role in at least this incident. And we know they're playing a role in other incidents. There's been lots of mass shooter manifestos posted and stuff like that. But we know relatively little about gun culture itself in social media. And gun culture is probably has a pretty big impact on how and why people are becoming, obsessed with guns and all of this kind of stuff where they're able to buy guns online and talk about just everything about it. So we don't know much about gun culture at all online, and very little in fringe social media like 4chan. So we want to know things like, what do they talk about? How are they talking about things? Just what kind of behavior do they exhibit, these gun enthusiasts? And so gun culture is it's not exactly the most precise word in the world, but it's a general set of beliefs and actions related to gun ownership. There's a fair amount of literature from criminology and sociology that's going to talk about two main branches of gun culture. First is gun culture 1.0. And this is kind of the traditional stuff, at least in the US, masculinity, sentimental value. These are the things that kind of drive this gun culture 1.0. Then there's also this gun culture 2.0, which is a more recent thing. Like, I don't know, I think in the past 50, 60 years is when it started to become kind of developed. And gun culture 2.0 is focused more on things like self-defense, empowerment, so how guns give you power, and freedom and patriotism, stuff like that. Less about masculinity and sentimental value, and more about these kind of more political things. And also in the criminology and sociology literature, there's been aspects of fetishism associated with guns and gun culture. And these are kind of the things that we're going to kind of take a look at, right? So there's sexual fetishism, religious fetishism, magical protections, powers that help protect, that kind of stuff. And so that's what we want to kind of discover and learn about in about gun culture and fringe online, fringe social media. It's criminology and sociology, mostly in qualitative and a lot of theory, but I'm in the School of Computing, and so I'm very interested in if we can measure this kind of stuff. Things like, how does gun culture manifest itself in discussions? Can we get a quantitative understanding of that? Do we see quantitatively and at scale signs of gun attachment in social media? And do we actually see those signs of gun attachment kind of moving towards fetishism? So these are the kind of questions that I had about online gun culture, and the first thing that you need to do anytime you're going to do any measurement stuff is you need to acquire data. So K was mentioned in the Attorney General's report, and that's the data set we use. So 4chan's K is their weapons board. It's just what it says, right? It's for everything weapons. Guns are the primary topic, but they do talk about swords and knives and tanks and all that kind of good stuff. Um, if you know 4chan, which I think probably most people do in 2024, it's kind of like the butthole of the internet, if you will. And one of the biggest forums or boards on 4chan is Poll, the politically incorrect board, which is known for like being one of the most racist and that kind of crazy stuff on the internet. So K is not Poll, and I want to make that clear up front, but it is still 4chan. So as an idea of what I mean, here I have the number of posts to K in the past 30 days, like as of this morning, that have the N word in them. And you can see that there's goodly amounts per day, but down here I have that compared to Poll, right? And so K is the blue stuff right here. So while you do have 4chan type behavior, it should be understood that this is not Poll. This is not the super racist extremist part of 4chan. But finally, we go out and collect the data, and we build a pipeline to analyze it. So we wound up with 4.5 million posts, if you will, for about a year. We will no full year, all of 2022. And then we built a big analysis pipeline where we did some NLP stuff to do topic modeling. And then eventually we're going to go look at more detailed stuff, but a big pipeline to run through all this data. All right. So now we can start getting into some results. So the first question that we're going to talk about is, what does the discussion on K look like? And so we went through our pipeline, got all of our topics, and then we clustered them together. And we wound up with three clusters. All right. One, the red one here. Right, this is the Russia-Ukraine war. So you see stuff like literally you have Russia and Slava Ukraine, but then drones, grenades, that kind of stuff. Another one was the general warfare. So if you remember the a couple slides ago, K is about weapons of all types, not just guns, but tanks and planes and stuff like that. And that's what they're kind of discussing here. Talk about nukes and ships and drones and missiles again. And then finally up here, we had a cluster, the biggest cluster, that is all about guns, which is really what we're interested in this work. So I'm going to ignore these two clusters down here, and everything I'm going to talk about further is based on posts that fall into these gun clusters, so we can understand what's going on. The first thing, simple. What are they talking about? If we look at the individual topics and the threads and posts that appear in them, or that have those topics, we can see some interesting things. So first off, we have orange here, which is the gun culture 1.0. So things like collection, marksmanship, hunting, like kind of these, I don't want to say normal, but more somewhat accepted, aspects of gun ownership, at least in America. Then we have the green stuff, which is gun culture 2.0. So we see stuff like religious posts, and self-defense, and talking about the law. So, self-defense and all that kind of good stuff. And then we have in blue, we have all these other categories. Okay. These other categories that don't fit cleanly into gun culture 1.0 and 1.2. But as we'll see a little bit later in this next set of analyses, actually, these do have some relationship to attachment and then therefore fetishism. So now I'm going to talk about fetishism in this online gun culture. And this is I think, pretty interesting. It's more than just, these previously described gun culture 1.0 and 2.0 type of stuff, and it goes a little bit further. So we have hints in the theoretical literature that attachment to guns, there are some displays of fetishism associated with that it leads to fetishism in guns. And there's lots of types of these gun attachments that can lead to fetishism. For example, you have collection, right? And here's some examples that we have from our data set. People, buying 20 guns, right? He can't even shoot 20 guns, right? He can barely have 4 or 5, but he loves them, right? He needs to get over his gun fetish and pare down his hoard, right? Sexual stuff. This also makes sense, I think, a lot. I mean, this person straight up favorite gun AK-47, their sexual fetish, skirts and stockings. Maintenance. So this, if you're not familiar with gun ownership, a big part of it is cleaning your gun and maintaining them. And people, take great pride in how their guns look and how they're, put together. Then there's also some more, I would say, perhaps less expected stuff. So like this religious fetishism, where here's somebody that's talking about Jesus Christ, if he ever existed, but whatever, was not a fan of rendering more to Caesar than was Caesar, and explicitly advocated for personal ownership of weapons. And he said Jesus was pretty K, right? So this is somebody that's attributing some kind of religious aspect to gun ownership, and in fact, the gun culture of K itself. And also a fair degree of things like conspiracies and nationalism. If you want to think about it in a positive sense, you can call this patriotism. But here's an example where it's talking about the deep state, and both Biden and DeSantis are deep state. Zelensky is deep state. Right? Because they're out to destroy people, and that true American patriots are going to have guns to resist tyrannical takeovers. So this is the type of fetishism that we saw in general. But it's probably a little bit more interesting to understand how these type of fetish signals, how they correlate to different topics. So like this, how they correlate to these type of topics that I discussed previously, so that we can have an idea of what topics fetishism is exposed in. And that's exactly what we have. We have a heat map here with, on the left side is the or is a variety of labels and topics, and we're going to see what the how things correlate. So basically, bottom line, different types of fetishism are expressed across different topics. So, for example, here we have masculinity, sexual masculinity is very highly correlated with just sexual fetishization. I think that probably makes sense to a good extent. We see stuff like freedom. So, topics talking about freedom are highly correlated with religious signals of fetishism. And we also see things like physical power. So the idea of being strong and powerful, those are highly correlated with signals of fetishism, signals of self-defense here. So, bottom line, what we found is that the gun culture is online, at least, is a bit different than what exists or was described in the criminology and sociology literature. While these gun culture 1.0 and 2.0 branches do exist, we actually have a lot of other things going on, which makes the situation more complicated. And it makes it more difficult to really understand how we might mitigate this. There's questions of laws and all this kind of stuff, but we have people that are really dedicated to this and they care about these guns. So next, all of this was text-based analysis, and after however many years of doing this and looking mostly at textual data, I'm tired of reading, and probably lots of others of you are. And turns out lots of Americans are as well, and people across the world, really. So there's been, after COVID-19, or really during COVID-19, we saw a surge in podcasts. So lots of podcasts started showing up. And as of 2022, about 20% of the US population is listening to podcasts. That's a big chunk of people in a relatively small period of time, because it wasn't 20% 5 years ago. And in fact, by the end of 2023, podcasts have, they started audio only, but they've started to transition, right? They've grown a bit, and half of the top 30 podcasts, more than half of them, are available as videos. Things like on YouTube. I think YouTube has a video podcast, Spotify has video podcasts, that kind of stuff. And along with this growth rather, we've seen an increased number of right-wing podcasters who, unsurprisingly, have clashed with moderation policies on mainstream platforms like YouTube, where they've been demonetized or even banned. So we don't really know all that much about the podcast infrastructure, and we know very little about these alternative platforms that popped up because people have been getting demonetized and stuff like that on YouTube. And so we took a look at one of these platforms called Rumble. It's a YouTube clone, essentially, right? There's some differences, but for the guts, it's a YouTube clone. And if you haven't heard of Rumble, they've been in the news relatively frequently because you know, they have been involved in some bad stuff, like having Nazi content and hosting Andrew Tate, who, if you don't know who he is, Google him. He's not a good guy. Promoting conspiracies, right? This Rebel platform, lots of flat Earth conspiracies and vaccine conspiracies and all that kind of stuff among its curated section, like I guess hand curated. And just in case, you're still not convinced that Rumble is relevant. It's a public company. So Rumble is a public company, and it's not worth a ton per share, $7.10 or 11 cents of this morning, but it's up 63% year to date. So somebody thinks that it's worth money and that it has influence and all this kind of good stuff. So what we wanted to do is go check out and understand the podcast ecosystem, specifically on Rumble, but we want to compare it to YouTube. And to do that, we built a big data collection and analysis pipeline, as I often do in my work. First, we had data collection stuff, right? Just collecting the data. And then we made use of the three kind of modalities of content, or three modalities that these podcasts have along with them. So video metadata, which I don't really discuss in this talk, the title, the keywords, the hashtags, whatever, that kind of stuff. Speech to text. So this I do talk about. And so, podcasts have audio, and we wanted to do some analysis on what they're talking about, right? So we use a generative AI model, a version of Whisper, which is originally from OpenAI, but this is an open source version. And we do speech to text on all the videos we collect. And then also, again, because it's multimodal, we want to take a look at the visual content that is being used in these podcasts. So we have a whole nother branch of analysis here where we're going to look at the frames, the images in the actual podcast videos, and then we're going to take a look at what those images are and how they cluster together. So we built our data collection system, collected a good amount of content. So I think it's about I can't remember, it's 4,000, I think, give or take, between each of these platforms, YouTube and Rumble, and it comes out to, again, I can't remember the full detail, 6 months, I think, of continuous like audio and video. So if you played them back to back to back, it'd take about 6 months. So it's a good amount of data, and we processed it all. If you're interested in the data set, it's out there, and we're going to answer a couple of questions here. So we have this data, we have an analysis pipeline. Let's use it to answer some questions. So the first one, is Rumble just a YouTube clone? And this is, I think, a big important question. I showed the headlines before, but there's been headlines along, similar to that for YouTube as well. So let's see if Rumble's just a YouTube clone. I think that's pretty important. There's lots of alternative social media platforms. I talked about one of them already. Here's another, and I'm going to talk about a third after I get done with this. Most of them, including Rumble, they claim to be free speech oriented, if you will. That's one of the reasons that they're able to attract all the people that were banned basically from YouTube or demonetized. They say, hey, we are a free speech alternative. Come here to us, and we won't demonetize you and all that kind of good stuff. And you can have whatever content you want. The reality of the situation is that most of these alternative platforms end up being primarily right-wing and often extremist. They say we're for free speech, but in reality, they tend to exhibit only one type of speech, if you will, or one side of the coin. So how can we measure this in some way, right? How can we measure this with our the data that we've collected? We want to see, hey, is Rumble like politically aligned with YouTube? What are the differences? And the idea that we came up with is to use a set of labeled political YouTube channels. So there's, or politically labeled, I should say, YouTube channels. So we have this data set that we didn't create, we took from somebody else, and they had, I can't remember the number of channels, maybe it's a few hundred, that they labeled as being left, right, or neutral. It's important to note that these were not podcasts. These are just traditional style YouTube channels. So we're going to have a distinct data set, the stuff that we collected and this other data set right here. And the basic idea is compare the podcast topics that we got from YouTube and Rumble and see how they compare to the labeled YouTube channel topics. Well, the idea is, hey, if a given podcast video is more aligned, or right, it's closer when you take embeddings and with a left-wing channel, then it's going to be a left-wing podcast, or at least that episode is going to be more about left-wing stuff. And again, this is important to note, this is not metadata based, but this is actually the output from our speech to text. So this is not just what the content creators have decided to label their own stuff as, but this is the actual stuff that's being said in the podcast. And surprise, surprise, like I said, as typically happens, Rumble is mostly right-wing. So here I have a plot where we normalized between -1 and 1, left wing, right wing, or neutral, the cosine similarities. And we took a look at the top 20 topics, top 40, 80, and 160. And over here, I have the full set where you can see, hey, what lean towards more similar to the right or more similar to the left. Bottom line is that YouTube content is neutral in general. YouTube podcasts are neutral. They're not political really in any sense. There are some that are, but mostly they're about non-political topics, if you will. Rumble content, much more right wing. And we can see this for the top set of subtopics, right? So Rumble is in this yellow, and it's leaning more towards the right. Right, this is 0 right here, and we can see the distribution is pushed all the way over to the right, versus YouTube is pretty much centered. One interesting thing to note here is if you're only talking about the top 20 topics that appear in YouTube podcasts, we do see, so this is neutral right here, and the peak is to the right of that. So we do actually see that, at least in the most popular topics, if you will, YouTube is a little bit right wing leaning, but still nowhere near as right leaning as Rumble. And YouTube goes more back to neutral as you incorporate more topics. In fact, you can see that really clearly here on the scatter plot, where we actually have the neutral line with a slope of 1.1. It's a dotted or dashed black line, and you can barely see it at all. So see right down here, you may be able, depending on how good your monitor is and my connection is, you may be able to see a little bit of a dashed line, but then it disappears pretty quick, right? The YouTube line is right on top of it, has a slope of 1.0 and a very high R squared, so it works. Rumble, on the other hand, you can see the trend line is way above neutral, so way closer to right leaning, and not very neutral at all. Only time we really see much neutrality is, a little bit of stuff here, but then there's huge separation. So even though Rumble, is a free speech alternative, and theoretically there is content that's could be representing both sides, if you will, the reality situation is that no, the majority of content is right wing, and significantly different from the distribution on YouTube there for YouTube podcasts. Okay, so I did the nice stuff with speech to text. We could find some stuff out, and we see that Rumble's looking kind of right wing. But next, I want to make use of the visual elements, right? So podcasts have become, in large part, visual. It gives us a new modality to play with, and it might reveal some additional things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to extract representative frames. So we're going to go through the video, and we're going to say, hey, is frame N, is it sufficiently different from a sliding window, I think is how we did it, of previous frames, right? And if it is, we'll take that as a representative frame, and we'll throw everything, non-representative frames away. Makes our analysis much more tractable. So we do that. And a first finding here is that there's a CDF of the number of representative frames per video. And as we see kind of like right up front, YouTube videos, this is interesting. I think YouTube podcasts, in general, tend to have more diversity in their visual content, or at least they're doing more edits where the image is changing more often. Rumble is, has a decent diversity, so it's not like it's just a static image. But YouTube podcasts do seem to be making, I don't know if it's better use, but certainly more use of the video format here. So once we have these frames, we're going to cluster similar frames using embeddings. We're going to use clip. So there's lots of different embeddings that we could use here. The representative frames are visual, right? There's visual differences, but now we want to get some semantics of these images to actually see what they are. So we're going to use a clip, which is a contrastive learning model that can take an image and give you text, description of it, or vice versa. It can help you find similar images and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to use clip to understand what some of these images, what they mean, what they're actually about. And we're going to cluster them together. And here's what the clustering kind of looks like. So Rumble stuff is basically all this, and you can see like here's Jen Psaki, here's Biden, here's Clinton, here's DeSantis, here's Kamala, right? Kamala Harris, a bunch of political. There's Trudeau down there, even a bunch of political figures. Whereas on YouTube, we see just people talking. We see people looking at web, Google Images. We see people typing. Yes, a much larger diversity of images. Pretty much everything on Rumble, not everything, but pretty much everything on Rumble has a political slant to it. And so, again, as we've seen numerous times before, these kind of alternative social media platforms that pop up, catering to a free speech crowd, and specifically kind of attracting or recruiting users that have been demonetized or banned or whatever, run afoul of moderation policies on different platforms. They usually end up just being kind of, I'm going to say echo chambers, but mostly right-wing content. Um, all right. So right-wing stuff is everywhere. I mean, it's the only stuff I've talked about so far today. There's plenty of people in this call that have dealt with primarily right-wing extremists because that's just what we've had the past 10 years or so. They've been very prevalent. They've had a lot of impact in the world. At the same time, we know a whole hell of a lot about them, and while there's still plenty of things to learn, sometimes it gets a little bit boring, let's say, right? Many of the findings and the results that are coming out of this type of work are, I wouldn't say not novel, but they make sense, right? It's not anything that surprises most people. But I'm going to switch pace for a little bit here. I'm gonna switch pace a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the USSR, the former Soviet Union. So, in case you don't know your history of USSR, they had pretty much all of Eastern Europe, and it was a pretty authoritarian regime, especially in the period shortly after World War II. So here I have a picture in 1956 where the USSR rolled tanks into Hungary to try and put down the Hungarian Revolution. So they were trying to break off from the USSR, and the USSR rolled tanks in to put down the revolution. In 1968, Warsaw Pact tanks invaded Czechoslovakia in reaction to another, essentially protest of the Prague Spring, right? And they rolled tanks in and just smash, right? Just stomped all over the opposition, right? The people that were wanting to not live under their boot heel. And from this came a group of people known as tankies. Makes sense, right? They were called tankies because they were supporters of hardline Russia. They were the people that were very happy to see and excited to see that there were tanks coming in to crush the opposition. Right? They literally supported tanks being used in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, hence the name tanky. That was 50, 60 years ago, right? The USSR is long gone, Soviet Russia is long gone, and times have changed. And you may or may not have guessed what's coming next, but tankies have evolved and they've moved online. And things have changed quite a bit. So here, if you don't know what a tanky is in the modern sense, they are kind enough to have on one of their big subreddits given us a definition. And they say that they are people that support actually existing socialist countries. So they call themselves Marxist Leninists, and they like this actually existing socialist country stuff. And again, they have an online presence and a goodly amount of people that are involved in this online. So you might be asking yourself, what's an actually existing socialist country? That sounds kind of weird. And if we take a look at what they describe as actually existing socialist countries, we get a better idea of what's going on. So People's Republic of China, the CCP, that's an actually existing socialist country that they support. Cuba, okay, Vietnam, the same former Soviet Union, which we'll see later includes Russia these days. Venezuela, this type of stuff. And also, I want to point out the second although I guess this is alphabetical, but the second country listed that they support is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. Or I'm sorry, not South Korea. Not South Korea. It's North Korea. Um, and that I'm suspecting probably raises a few people's eyebrows. There's not, I'm sure we have all met communists and left-leaning people. We have them in our circles. There's not many of them that would be supporters of North Korea, right? I would wagering that there's not many of them that would even consider North Korea a socialist country in the first place. But these guys do. So they have lots of means, right? They do genocide denial. So they're denying here, they're denying the genocide, the Holodomor, which was in Ukraine, the Ukrainian genocide. We have examples of them denying the Uyghur genocide in like actually calling it a non-existent genocide, right? And comparing it to Gaza, saying, hey, why could you be doing this non-existent genocide when there's one happening in Gaza? We have people like Jackson Hinkle, who is a big, I guess, tanky personality, although I don't think he calls himself a tanky anymore. He, in fact, calls himself a MAGA communist, which is probably also a term you haven't heard of before, but might give you a little bit, a little bit crisper idea of who these people are. Um, so we wanted to take a look at these left-wing extremists because they are showing back up. But what do we know about left-wing extremists at all? Pretty much nothing. Okay. There's very little quantitative work on the far left at all, but there's lots of theory on the far left. Obviously, there's lots of theory in communism and political science and stuff like that. But even in that literature, right, there's almost nothing on far left extremists, right? They're always just treated as the far left, but not extremists, let's say. And so we set out to see if we can figure out what's going on. And as I did previously, we built a nice little data collection pipeline and analysis pipeline. And we went out and looked at we found six tanky subreddits who have different start times, but we stopped our data set at March 2022 because that's when tankies ended up getting banned from Reddit for spreading misinformation about the Russia-Ukraine war. And while we do have some relatively small, like kind of this is a pointless subreddit, this one right here is very small. We do have some big subreddits. Dong, which was their main one, 50,000 unique authors and almost 1.3 million posts in less than 3 years. That's a pretty big subreddit, right? These aren't tiny subreddits. And in fact, to demonstrate how big they are, I have here a plot of the number of unique users per month for Gen Zedong, the biggest tanky subreddit, as well as the biggest subreddits for more mainstream far left ideologies, if you will. So this is tankies, and it's pretty obvious that they came from nothing and quickly grew. And then by the middle of 2021, they had become the most popular subreddit of any far left subreddits. So this is a pattern that we see a lot with extremist communities. It's along the lines of an extremism pipeline, if you will. There's some results that I'm not going to show, but a lot of this growth came from siphoning off users from these other mainstream far left subreddits. And that's a little bit worrying, right? Because you don't really want supporters, or probably don't want supporters in North Korea to be the most prominent far left voices on your platform. And in fact, Reddit did ban them, right? This is when Reddit banned them, right? Right when Russia invaded Ukraine. So they're a pretty big community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're particularly different than any other far left communities. So we need to ask some questions. Are they extreme? Right? They smell like left wing extremists, but there's some people who think Biden's a left wing extremist. And also importantly, the plural of anecdote is not data. We can't just say, hey, they say this stuff. They say they like North Korea. That means they're extremists. So we want to take a look at where tankies are positioned with respect to other left-wing communities. The idea here is we're going to make a network where nodes are a bunch of political ideology subreddits. Nodes are linked together based on the number of users that post in both of those both subreddits. And we're going to run community detection on that network. And then we're going to lay the network out such that the distance between nodes is inverse to their similarity. So the more similar things are together, the closer they are on the plot. And here's what it's going to look like. And we have some pretty clear clusters. So green is capitalists. You'll notice that there's conservatives and Democrats and liberals and Republicans in here, but those ideologies are all capitalist in nature. The next thing interestingly enough, in our political ideology subreddit, there was a pretty meaningful cluster of feminist subreddits. The gray is just general leftists, so progressives, that kind of stuff. And then the orange is the far left communities, so like our communism, international workers, can't remember what the IWW stands for, international workers something, but it's another one, art, anarchism, Marxism, that kind of stuff. And then all the way here, the furthest from the capitalists and even kind of hanging out on their own from the far lefts and the leftists, we have tankies, right? So they are, at least in terms of user overlap, they are on the extreme end. They have a much tighter community that is further away in terms of users than from capitalism than anything else. So they are hanging out on the extreme side of things there. But another question, perhaps more importantly, is how are they different? Not just that they're different, but we want to quantify this difference. And so the idea here is that we're going to look at differences in language, and we're going to look at something called misalignment. And what we're asking here is, what words do different communities use to reference the same concept? So the canonical example for this is Republicans use the word Democrat the same way that Democrats use the word Republican. Different words, but they have the same concept, right? It's like my political opposition in this case. To do this, we can make use of word embeddings. What we're going to do is we're going to look for which word A used in community A is closest to a word B in community B, such that word A and word B are not the same. And this works by projecting these embeddings onto a set of anchor words and blah, 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 details in the paper. But the idea is we're going to find words that mean the same thing, but they're actually different words in each community. And so here's some of these results here. So we're comparing tankies to the more, again, mainstream far left communities. So this is tankies compared to communism, our socialism, our democratic socialism, our anarchism. And we've covered these different misalignments kind of in a general topic. So here we see, right, on the left is the word that tankies use, and on the right is the word that our communism use. Tankies use, our socialism uses. Tankies use, our socialism uses, all right? And the pink colored stuff is for China or CCP related stuff. And right from the get-go here, we can see a difference. So CPC stands for the Communist Party of China, and CCP stands for the Chinese Communist Party. CPC is China's preferred nomenclature. So in the West, we use CCP, but China prefers if people use the acronym CPC. And we see that in our socialism as well. And we see it compared to our communism. So all these other far left subreddits are using the traditional, I don't know, traditional is not the right word, but the Western nomenclature versus the Chinese government preferred nomenclature. This blue highlighted stuff is about the Ukraine-Russia war. And what we can see is, right, tankies say LPR and DPR, which are I can't remember the exact one, but it's something republic. It's the regions in Crimea that in 2014 that Russia took from Ukraine, and they kind of made these, like, I don't know, I can't remember what they're actually called. They call them these republics, though, and that's how they justified taking that land, because hey, the LPR is what Russia calls it. That's something, whatever it is, republic. Whereas the real region in Ukraine is Donetsk, and again, the DPR and Donbass. So tankies are using the Russian name for things, and everybody else is using the real name, the Ukrainian name. Lime is Stalin. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into politics, but I think most people understand who Stalin was. Big time authoritarian, killed tons of people, ran the Soviet Union after Lenin died. Erased people, all this kind of stuff. One of his opposition when he was ascending to the head of the Communist Party was I think Leon Trotsky, who was a less authoritarian um, communist, let's say. And Tankies are talking using, they call Trotskyists people that didn't like Stalin. They talk about de-Stalinization, whereas the other groups talk about Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier, I think, that started the de-Stalinization process. We also, using the same thing, we can do something called conceptual homomorphism, which is when word A doesn't even exist in the vocabulary of word B. So it's a totally different word that one vocabulary has, the other don't, but they mean the same thing. And so here's an example. This is oftentimes slang, and in fact, that's what it is here. Whereas Tankies, and you can see from the green, they don't prefer to use the word Jew or Israel. They just use the word Zionist, right, to refer to their concerns with Israel, to the point where they even have a slang word "isn't real" instead of Israel. And for the same thing, they don't talk about Trump, but they talk about Zelensky in the same way that regular, let's say, far left communities talk about Trump. So, right, they feel as opposed to Zelensky as as democratic socialists feel to Trump, which is a pretty clear distinction. It's this kind of stuff here where tankies are really kind of hypocritical, where they go after Israel, but they're totally happy that Russia is invading Ukraine, right? Even though it's kind of the same thing, they're just not aligned with, I think, most normal people in the world, or a lot of mainstream stuff. Before I wrap up, I did mention that Tankies got banned from Reddit. And so the problem solved, right? They got banned shortly after the current Ukraine-Russia war started, and Reddit took care of them for spreading misinformation. And so now the problem's solved, right? Well, no, this talks about alternative social media platforms, and it turns out that Tankies moves to one. They moved to something called Lemmy, which is a decentralized Reddit clone. It's open source, decentralized, it's like Mastodon, and it's part of the Fediverse. Each individual instance, Lemmy instance, is independently owned and operated, as is common in federated stuff. But the project is actually created and run by a Tanky. So guess what? There was an instance that was fired up and has existed for a long time called Lemmigrad. And as you can see by their logo, they're tankies, right? There's a tank right there. And so let's take a quick look at what happened here. So this is the number. So Lemmy's existed for, I think, like four years or so, 4 or 5 years. And they had this Lemmigrad instance for the same amount of time because the creator of the project is a tanky. And they were archiving stuff, and they were talking about things in general, various topics. But then once they got banned from Reddit, all right, which was right about here, boom, in their specific tanky community is what Lemmy calls them, but their specific Lemmy subreddit, we see a huge spike, right? We went from 96 posts from 58 users in January 2022 to April, 8,600 posts from 1,000 unique users. So again, these aren't giant numbers, but this is a big jump. They didn't just leave, they didn't just dissolve. They just went to their own platform. And this brings up an interesting and worrying problem that, as we've seen in the past, to various degrees, when you deplatform these kind of extremist groups, they go to their own platform. They don't really. It's not like they get better. If anything, they get worse, and we see signs of it. So we took a look using the Perspective API to look at different types of toxicity, and as you can see, right, we have an increase in the number of high toxicity scores across all of these models right after they were banned from Reddit, and they got an influx of new users who had been banned from Reddit and wanted to keep their community alive. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, first off, fringe online communities are commonplace now, right? I showed you three. There's dozens more. I mean, Scored, we have a data set from Scored, which is a Reddit clone where all the QAnon people went and the Donald people went. Um, many. There's alternative streaming platforms, lots of social media platforms now. And right, they're commonplace. So it's really easy to start up your own Reddit clone now. There's open source versions, they're like Lemmy, that work great, right? They're functional, they scale well. It's easy to spin something up. We can't turn a blind eye to this though, right? When we kick these people to the curb, when we moderate them, when we ban them from places like Reddit, they get worse, right? They get worse. So we just can't afford anymore to pretend like you ban people from Reddit and then stuff's better. And in fact, we should probably do a little bit more to take this type of behavior into account when we're designing moderation systems and policies. So while banning does work, it makes Reddit a better place. Is it really the best thing for Reddit to be better, but then 1,000 radicalized users start to become more toxic, start to organize together, and in a place where only people like me who spend all their time looking at this weird stuff even know about. um and finally, I'll probably be in business for a while because this stuff ain't going anywhere. So hopefully some of you will help address these issues as well. And so thanks for your time. And follow me on Blue Sky because I need some followers on that thing. Any questions?
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Hmm.
Really interesting stuff. Yeah, I think you're really digging into stuff that isn't being talked about by as many people, at least that I'm aware of. So it's super cool. I really appreciate you digging into this in a lot of detail. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes left, so please, if anybody wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand with the Zoom thing. I see Phil's got his hand up, so I'll let him dig in.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jeremy. Interesting talk as
Hmm.
always. A little scary, and also I learned a lot of stuff like MAGA communists. Lots of new stuff. But okay, I have a couple of questions there, but feel free to answer only one because there are other questions from other people. You pick. One is about the last stuff. Like you're saying, yeah, if you ban fringe people, they form their online communities, they can become even more toxic. But
Hmm.
is that really necessarily bad? In some sense, you could also say that they are just talking to other fringe people and they have less of a possibility of spreading or mainstreaming their extremist and possibly harmful views to the general population. After all, fringe people have always existed, right? Even if
Hmm.
they were not
Hmm.
online, maybe they had a harder time to find each other, and online communities make it easier for them to find each other, but maybe it'll be harder to find critical mass and to have bigger impact. So
Hmm.
I want your thought on this general trade-off. The other question is going back to the beginning of your talk, where you were talking about, people talking about guns and also some of these people then doing very bad things.
Hmm.
Um, you know, is there a way to find a causal link? Like, is there a way that research that you do, that we do, that others do could see whether in fact exposure to this kind of extremist gun content online causes people like the guy
Yeah.
who went and bought a gun near your house and then went on and killed a bunch of people? Is there a way to study those causal links? Just feel free
Yeah.
to answer either one.
Yeah. I'll answer that one. I'm a lot of times no, because we have limited view, and these are usually singular persons, right? It's much easier for us to do getting an idea of things, especially causal stuff, if we have a lot of data. That said, there is a lot of, I mean, it's not anecdotal, but from my perspective, it kind of is. There is a lot of evidence like this, right? Where even if we can't say anything about the radicalization pipeline, we can say that these communities um, made it possible to execute what these guys executed. So, I mean, I don't know. That's more work that needs to be done because I agree, and for sure, I'm not saying that we should make guns illegal and stuff like that, but hopefully we can get some more insight. Maybe it'll help guide policy. And then the second thing you asked about is yeah, they have less reach. And is it that big of a deal that they're just kind of echo chambering themselves? And I don't disagree. So it should be absolutely clear that it does, banning people absolutely reduces reach. And that is not a bad thing. Okay, because it is, having an audience of 10 million people is way more powerful than having an audience of 100 people or 1,000 people. At the same time, um, it can be pretty surprising what even 1,000 people can do if you lead them to their own devices. And so I guess that's really where the challenge is like, yes, it's I'm not saying we shouldn't ban people, but maybe think about other policies that may be less likely to push people in the further direction. But you're right. I mean, that's the way things are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. Cece.
Oh, hi, Jeremy. So nice
Hey,
to meet
Cece.
you.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy and I actually collaborate, and Jeremy is a very important mentor in my research career. And I actually have a very similar question as Filippo's. After 9/11, the U.S. government have the Patriot Act.
Mhm.
They forced the library to hand over the list of names who borrowed the books related to the terrorism. And then the library, they have the freedom to read campaign. It's quite
Mhm.
similar situation as what we are now having on the social media, except the social media like they provide some kind of immersive echo chamber things for all those users that drive them to, act some very evil things. So you have presented wonderful studies presenting our situation. And I was wondering, what do you think is, what kind of moderation do you think is a good idea for not letting them deplatforming, have them to expose certain kind of gun culture, but forbidden them to develop into something serious. Like what you have present, like the Chinese videos, the communism mega.
Mhm.
I see there is a lot of comments they flow over the videos. I
Mhm.
actually use that social media a lot. One
Mhm.
thing they avoid the echo chamber is they pay for people, although they did not mention that, they pay for people to have different ideas because
Mhm. Mhm.
just on that social media are the teenager or younger. They
Mhm. Mhm.
watch the cartoons on that social media. Then they put something, communism on them for a kind of propaganda.
Mhm.
They also directly shuffle the videos. So do you think it's a good idea, like how we watch TV, we shuffle between, so we will
Yeah.
immerse ourselves into the gun culture or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, so I do think that I'll talk about the moderation stuff, and I don't know. It's not a good answer. I'm leaning more towards soft moderation stuff, as opposed to banning lately, and that can go anywhere from putting labels to even maybe quarantining stuff, like Reddit quarantine subreddits where you have to click a few buttons to get in. But these are always tough problems to talk about with moderation because they're ultimately like political freedom stuff. And at least in the US, right, the Constitution gives us gives us the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So we can't, people are not just allowed to talk about them, allowed to own them. I really don't know. I'm not, I mean, again, we know that moderation policies have been successful in reducing breach, but I don't know if anything has been successful in at least preventing radicalization or anything like that so far. So I don't know. It's an open problem. I don't have a good answer to that. And I don't know if it's recommendation algorithms. I don't know if it's forcing people to have valid viewpoints. I don't know. It's still for sure a big open research problem. Yeah.
Yeah, another thing is like the children mode. They force
Mhm.
like a recommendation algorithm to avoid this kind of content for the teenagers.
Mhm.
Do you think it's a viable way?
I mean, so there's different things here. You have kids and then you have like teenagers, let's say. And although stuff like YouTube has gotten better, but back in the, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago or whatever, we had papers that showed that the YouTube algorithm that was targeted towards kids was still having inappropriate stuff. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad idea, but it's not going to cure. I mean, it's
Yeah.
still the same type of problems, right? Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Awesome, thanks. We are just about over time. Jeremy, if you don't want to take maybe one more question, we can, but if you have to run, that's totally okay.
No, I got a few
Um,
minutes.
Okay. Dinesh, I think you are next in line, so apologies to Rasika and Ani, but we have to cut it, so.
Awesome. So I have a quick one. So I wanted to ask about your the video content pipeline.
Mhm.
If you could move to that slide.
This one, yeah?
Uh, yes. So here you
Uh-huh.
have a bunch of videos. Why do you
Mhm.
do p hash and then do clip embeddings?
Okay,
Just
so recall that we have like 6 months worth of video,
hmm
like in total, like if you lay them back to back 6 months. So the bottom line is that we computationally couldn't run every frame. So
hmm
we wanted to get representative frames. So it's purely a computational thing because there's
hmm
really, is there really that much? It's not going to tell us more
hmm
if we have this picture of Jen, like 30 seconds of this video that's basically the same picture of Jen Psaki. So that's all
hmm
it was. It was just to really to reduce the computational costs so that we only have to run clip on the actual representative images. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep, that's smart. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thank you. All right, one more, Phil says. Okay. Rasika, go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for your presentation. So I had like two questions, and you can like pick which one you can answer. So the
Sure.
first one was kind of just like how you're defining fringe platforms and alternative social media platforms, because 4chan and Mastodon both seem kind of alternative, but I think of them
Yeah.
like very differently. So I was just wondering how you define that. And the second question that I had was like going back to everyone's thoughts about moderation. So I know that like a lot of alternative social media platforms kind of do their own moderations for like each communities and things like that. So do you think like that's a good way to go, or should they have like more centralized systems like Twitter and Reddit have, or are we looking at, wanting to have the better option being that there be federal policies in place that kind of like impose certain restrictions?
Yeah, good question. So first off, I'll talk about the fringe versus alternative social media. So I guess I kind of use them interchangeably, but I would consider an alternative social media platform anything that is largely trying to clone an existing big social media
Mm-hmm.
platform. So Mastodon would be an alternative social media platform. Blue Sky, I guess, is an art of, currently maybe it'll be a mainstream platform eventually. And then Fringe, I don't have a very good definition for that, but it's basically I think of it as the type of communities, content, whatever that is pushed off of
Mm-hmm.
mainstream platforms. So on Mastodon, people go because they don't, in Blue Sky, they don't want to be on Twitter, not necessarily because they've been banned from Twitter, but on Gab, they go
Yeah.
there because they've been banned from Twitter. So that's how I consider the differences there. Then in terms of the moderation stuff, man, that's just a really good question. I have no answer for it. I'm generally opposed or at least conservative with the federal government getting into starting trying to regulate speech and stuff like that. I'm not a huge fan of it. But at the same time, yeah, clearly something has to be done because this stuff's going on. I really don't. I do like the way that Blue Sky has set things up where you can basically make moderation plugins. So users themselves could, if I make a moderation system here, they could attach that to their account and then, stuff like that. So it's a bit user chosen. But again, I mean, you can't let everything be user chosen and just let people run wild. I don't have a good answer though. This is hopefully something the policymakers are working on and taking more seriously. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Good ones. Wow.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah.
As usually happens for good talks, I don't get to ask any questions, but that's just the way it goes. So I'll just thank you again for joining us, and thanks everybody for showing up. We have some more lined up in the future, so please come back for the next one as well. So we'll say goodbye, but thanks again.
All right. Thanks for having me,
Thank
and I hope
you.
you all enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Definitely.
It's great.
All right. Bye bye. All. Have a
Bye
good
now.
rest
Thank
of the day.
you.